Welcome to the Biotech Startups podcast by Exceeder. Join us as we speak with first-time founders, serial entrepreneurs, and experienced investors about the challenges and triumphs of running a biotech startup, from pre-seed to IPO, with your host, John Chi.
My guest today is Terry Lowe, President and CEO of Vizgen. Vizgen is developing and commercializing the next generation of genomics tools to expand on the capabilities of spatially resolved transcriptomics. Vizgen's technology will aid the acceleration of biological research and discovery to advance human health. Terry is a pioneer in the emerging spatial biology market and has a proven track record of driving exceptional growth across global life science organizations, including Bristol-Myers Squibb, Hologic, Roche, PerkinElmer, and Akoya Biosciences. In addition to over 2 decades of experience scaling and building multinational biopharma and diagnostic groups, he is also an expert in developing business strategies for novel, innovative products. Over the next 3 episodes, we cover a wide range of topics, including Terry's upbringing in the Midwest, pursuing a master's degree in microbiology at Virginia Tech, transitioning from big pharma to diagnostics, the challenges of scaling up a business, and Vizgen's platform, mission, and plans for its product pipeline. Today, we'll chat about Terry's early years, studying psychology and molecular genetics as an undergraduate, and later microbiology and finance as a graduate student, transitioning from investment banking to corp dev and marketing roles at Bristol-Myers Squibb, and the importance of understanding customer needs and financial modeling and business development. Without further ado, let's dive into this episode of the Biotech Startups podcast. Terry, it's so good to see you again. Thanks for taking the time to come on the podcast.
Thank you, John. Great to be here.
Yeah, appreciate it. What were some early experiences, in your life that influenced your leadership style and business philosophy?
Yeah. Oh, that's great. So maybe I guess we're going to go back down memory lane. We'll start at the beginning. So first of all, I grew up in Ohio, right? So in kind of heart of the Midwest. My father's Chinese heritage and my mother's Korean. So a little bit of kind of mixed ethnic from the Asian side, and kind of growing up in a predominantly, I guess you'd call, white population in the Midwest. So, but pretty much, I would say, kind of a normal childhood growing up. Went to the local university, which was Ohio State University, or the Ohio State University, and kind of went through the normal college experience there. Maybe what was a little unusual, I probably spent more time in college than maybe the average college student. So I think by the time I graduated, it was probably 6 years later, finishing out my undergraduate. So I enjoyed my time, I would say, during those days.
Growing up, did you always know that you would get into science, or was it something where it kind of just like naturally developed as you were, just exploring?
Yeah. No, certainly I didn't know at that time that I would be kind of, really kind of into this hardcore science field. But I would say, number one, I always had a fascination of how things work. So I think that is certainly one of the ways that have tied me to the field. But maybe like a pretty stereotypical Asian family, I think the expectation was I was going to grow up to be a doctor or medical doctor, right? So that was kind of what was laid out for me. So that was sort of the path. And actually, I was interested in psychology, and my first major or first degree in undergrad was in psychology, because that was actually what really fascinated me about how behavior and how people think about things and why people do the things that they do. That sort of interaction I thought was always fascinating. And that's actually what I thought I wanted to get into. But I will tell you that did not go over well at home. And that's why I ended up with a second degree, which was in molecular genetics. And that's actually what ended up kind of getting me excited and interested about some of the sciences field.
That's awesome. And I love hearing that. And I think back on my personal experience too. I was originally exploring philosophy in the early days. And again, similar situations.
There's probably only one level worse than psychology, and that's probably philosophy.
You're like, what? what? We didn't move here. And I was like, whoa. There's like, this can be valuable too. But and the rest is history. But at Ohio State, and now you're doing a double major.
Yeah.
And did you have an undergraduate lab experience that got you kind of got your hands and like where it really just fired you up? Or was it something where it was kind of more academic in nature, where it was more, you know, via the book?
Yeah. I actually did lab work in psychology where I did a couple projects with different professors. And what's interesting, I think, is we often think of psychology as kind of a soft science, a social science, not really one of the hard sciences, but it's actually very technically driven. There's a lot of statistics involved, and it is very quantitative in that sense. So, it's not as far removed, I think, as many people, or maybe I thought, going into it. And then moving over into the genetics side, I think I had a really good, initial molecular biology, molecular genetics professor, and he just kind of really opened the door, right? It's something that, like, wow, this is a really exciting field. And that was also at a time, I think, where genetics was something that was very new and very hot and exciting, and people were talking about gene therapy. As that was the first time people were talking about gene therapy. And yeah, it was really, really exciting, I think, to start to get into some of that stuff.
Absolutely. And I think I had a similar experience too, where there were some notable professors that like on when you're originally on the pre-med track, it almost just feels like there's like cram as much as you can and
Yeah,
memorize as much as you can.
sure.
And then I remember having a formative experience where there are more creative side. Not to say that the practice of medicine can't be
Mhm.
creative, but at Berkeley they definitely did not make pre-med feel creative. But then had a very like a moment of inspiration where our professor was talking about like wet lab science, and I was like, oh, like it doesn't fully require just like cramming facts. This is amazing.
Talking about sort of the wet lab side and actually working in a lab. And I really didn't get that kind of experience until I went to grad school. So I went from there to do a master's in molecular microbiology at Virginia Tech, which was also another experience because you might think Ohio is kind of already out in the sticks, but Virginia Tech's in Blacksburg, which is maybe a little bit more remote. But that was really the first time I had a chance to actually, hold a pipette or, really kind of run experiments. And I think the learning from there was, yeah, I'm not so great at that. I'm not the master chef in the laboratory, and I think that also helped to drive sort of my career path thinking from that point. Is that, hey, maybe it's not being a scientist in the laboratory that's probably the best fit, but the science itself is still fascinating. And then where do I take that? And thinking about that more from a business direction is, kind of where I landed and where I ended up.
Likewise, there was a moment while in the lab, just like looking over at like my colleagues and being like, oh wow, this is what like you are in your element right now, like underneath the hood, and you are far better at this than I am. And I had a similar experience. I was like, I think probably I am I have a stronger affinity to the business and operations side than I do just like absolute pure research. That totally resonates with me.
Yeah. I mean, it's clearly both a skill and an art. I mean, the people that are there that are good at it, I mean, they are master chefs, right? They know how to make these experiments work. And for me, that's whatever the reason, whatever that gene is that makes you good at it. I guess I don't have it, but yeah. So it was time to pick another career. Um,
Totally.
yeah.
And I think too, using the analogy of like a kitchen can't just function with only a master chef. Like, right? Like there are various people. There's people who are on the grill, there are people who are doing sauces, like, and all of this together works together to make the dream work.
Yeah.
But I certainly when I was in the lab, I was like, crap, I want to be a master chef. But I think reflecting back on it now, it's kind of like that idea of it's kind of like an orchestra, and really for it to really work the way we want to, because like every time I think about science and anything, like if you're getting a drug approved or a diagnostic test, it's like a little miracle like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
And it needs to perfectly work. Like, and it takes a village, really, what I'm getting at.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that's the way the scientific field works as well, right? Which is everything is built on something else. And, it's hard to kind of pinpoint to say like, that really was the breakthrough or that was the person that invented this. And, a lot of times people are credited for certain things, but it is certainly a build-up process of, so many contributors all over the world contributing into the field. So that's for sure. I mean, that really was the point, I think, in my journey where I would say then it did sort of become a little bit more clear, like starting to map out, like, okay, I think I know what I want to do now, or at least I'm gonna create a plan. And from that point on, it really has been pretty well defined in terms of what I felt like, should be the steps, to the next phase, for my journey in my career. And it's kind of unfolded uncannily in some ways, kind of how I thought it might.
And so like right out of Virginia Tech grad school, did you know that business school was the path forward?
Yeah. So out of Virginia Tech, as I was finishing up my master's, and really that was where I was sort of mapping out, like, okay, what do I need to do to be, if I want to have sort of a scientific but also business commercial career, what are the things that are going to be important to be able to continue to move up in that journey? Actually, the first thing I sort of identified really was that, hey, key experience, commercially is that you have to know how sales works. Like sales is like the common denominator, like where like everything, ends up being a sell. So understanding the sales process, having experience of doing sales, and talking to a lot of other, I say, industry folks at the time, that really was the foundational piece. And what I also learned at the time, talking to others, was that, look, you want to do it sort of earlier in your career, because if you're moving up in your career and at some point, you're VP of R&D or whatever it is, you're not going to go back and get some sales experience. So,
Yeah.
if you're going to do it at some point in your career and you want that as part of your, your background, like you want to do that earlier on in your career. So that seemed like a very logical way. And so it's actually a somewhat of a not difficult way to leverage both science and, sales together, because, what I ended up doing was becoming a sales rep for a pharmaceutical company. So as a drug rep, sort of a classic, sales position in the industry. That's where I started to kind of pick up my sales experience. But even at the time when I was going through that process, or even interviewing in that process, I knew that was going to be, the next step after that would be to go to business school. So I already sort of planned that out as a next step afterwards.
And I gotta say, that's like awfully prescient of you to know that getting sales experience early is like a critical thing. I agree. Like, I don't think I had the foresight like you did. I was like, well, I got to figure this out. Like, it's going to have to pay the bills for Exceeder. And so I was like, all right. And for you, how was that experience like doing sales, like for the first time, after having been in the lab?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly was challenging. And I think there's there's also certain expectation, right? Salespeople you would think of them to tend to be very extroverted, right? Because they need to connect with the client. They need to be able to go talk to them. And, that's not me by nature. I'm more introverted than extroverted. So making that transition into a completely new field, completely new skill set of trying to sell, and also having that ability to kind of connect with people, I think that was definitely different, and definitely something that needed to be learned. But that was also important to be able to learn those kind of skills. I think what I did find to be more of a common denominator amongst the really good salespeople, that there's all kinds of personalities. I mean, they don't have to be extroverted. That's what I learned, and there are many introverted salespeople. It actually came down more to, I would say, this level of competitiveness that I found to be common amongst like the best salespeople. Like they were all like there to win. Like they were just so driven, just like any other like sports or any other competition, like they just needed to win, and they were so driven by that, being able to quantify that success, that's really, I think, the sort of way that I would say that was the most common characteristic that I found from the good salespeople. So that was also, I think, a very useful insight for me to kind of see like what really can make sales effective. Like, you don't have to be a certain way, you don't have to be a certain style. You just have to have kind of the drive.
Totally. And it's funny because I am also more introverted than I am extroverted. I had a moment of panic when I was first doing sales. I was like, I'm not built for this. I'm not when I was in the lab and got into my first foray of sales, I thought it was like, you got to be a person that can go into a room with strangers and just immediately have everyone like be your best friend. And
Right.
that's
Right.
not me. Like that's really not me. I'm far better at this kind of one-on-one smaller groups. Um, but exactly what you said, it was eye-opening to see that this kind of style, or my personal style, wasn't an outlier. There are definitely other people who kind of have a similar approach. But totally agree on the competitiveness. There's like, that is a driving force for sure.
Yeah. And I mean, one of the things I also learned is that, you really have to be creative to try to find out like where can you get an advantage that maybe other people don't bring in the same situation. I mean, you're competing against, these other salespeople who are trying to sell their drugs, and the doctor's offices, a lot of times they'll block off, like they won't let you go in to see the doctors. So how do you kind of get past those barriers? So being creative around that and sort of tapping into, your own maybe capabilities that might be unique, and just try to find some unique angles to solve those problems. It is a very intellectual kind of a challenge to go through.
Absolutely. It's like, and that was another eye-opening experience for me too, is how quantified and measured it is.
Yeah.
Because I honestly thought it was like, you go in, like shake some hands, bring charisma, and then like a deal is done. But it's much more than that. And I'm gonna imagine like there's there's buyer psychology for a reason, and like, your study into like psychology,
Yeah.
like it kind of lends itself well. So after your kind of initial foray into sales, it sounds like you then headed over to U Chicago for your MBA.
Yeah.
At what point did you decide, okay, it is time?
Yeah. Like I was saying, I sort of had kind of a preset idea, like I want to spend this much amount of time, and then it's not. And I should preface by saying, I'd spent, too long in undergraduate and maybe too
Yeah.
long in my master's. So it's like already like 9 years worth of school, like
Yeah.
where I had a real job. And so I didn't have a lot of time to burn at that point in my career,
Yeah.
like I had time to start moving on things. So um, yeah, so I planned for basically around 2 years to be in sales, and that's what I did. And so that sort of second year is when I started applying to business schools. And, part of it was also, I did want to go to a school that I felt had a very strong reputation, and something that, would be value added, as far as my own background, not only the skill sets, but that people could also say, hey, it's not just Joe Schmo, but there's some credibility just even having the right name, I guess, in terms of your background and your academic training. So that was also part of the thought process in terms of not just the timing, but what school to go to, and would it be worth it or not? I mean, business school is expensive, right? It's not
Not
free.
cheap. Yeah, yeah, not
Not free.
free.
There's no TA positions, or at least that I know of when I went to business school. So yeah, so it has to be something that you think is actually going to help you from a career standpoint, and those were some of the criteria. But again, trying to move beyond where I was in sales at the time, I felt like that was going to be an important piece to be able to have that experience.
Absolutely. And at U Chicago, what would you like? Were there any kind of like key lessons or takeaway you took away from that experience? And I know you also have had a focus on finance. So there's also like not all sales is finance, but so there's a bit of a specialty there.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that was, the finance piece, for me was is part of what I was, I guess, hoping to accomplish was to try to get a diversity of different skill sets of understanding different areas. And, business comprises so many different components. And, having already had the science background and getting the sales background. So I wanted to sort of leverage that as an opportunity to really kind of learn the finance side of things. Probably the two most useful things, though, I did at University of Chicago was I learned to golf. It
Yeah,
was
yeah, yeah,
one skill set I definitely picked up. Um, and there's casinos there also on the river. So
yeah, yeah.
that's also another skill set I learned also is how to gamble at the casinos.
Yeah.
Um, but the most probably useful thing actually that came out of it was so you do an internship, right, in your summer between your first and your second year in business school, and I did my internship in investment banking. And again, it's like completely night and day from working in the lab, from being in the
Yeah.
sales field, and now I'm working, Merrill Lynch investment banking, and it was another kind of really eye-opening experience. And I probably learned more from that 10-week period. Maybe in terms of things that kind of carried forward, it was such an intense time period, such a learning process that was just incredibly valuable, I think, in things that I took with me coming out from business school afterwards.
Yeah, I mean, investment banking is intense. And I haven't done it, but I have friends who have, and I'm like, woo, though that is like the hard mode of like business. They said like, yeah, like it really was that like the first couple opportunities, whether you're like a summer associate or like your first job out, that
Mm.
is really where you just like absorb like a sponge.
For me, I think it was very challenging compared to some of my peers. I mean, a lot of people go specifically to University of Chicago because they want to go into investment banking or they want to go into the finance field because they've already got that background, right? So many of them have already come from investment banking and then went to business school and went back to investment banking. Um, so I never had a job even where I've sat at a desk right up to this point where I sat in front of a computer as part of a regular job. Um, and the skill set required there's a lot of just financial modeling. I mean, just running Excel, right? Being an expert on Excel. I mean, I had no idea how to use Excel, right? I'm coming into an investment bank.
Yeah, yeah.
You have all these Excel jockeys sitting next to me, and I'm like, tapping in, one formula, looking it up, how to do it. And so it took me so much longer to get through sort of the projects that I was working on than the typical person that was coming in to do these summer associate positions. And so that was incredibly challenging for me. So there was like many all-nighters that, I'd have to kind of pull through, even above and beyond what you typically get in investment banking, just because I was so slow. I was so, not familiar with how this works and just trying to learn it as I was going. But I was way behind when I first started in that.
Yeah, and by the way, I had a similar experience too when I was like, so my co-founder kind of was in that world too, and he was like telling me how like he's been working on using Excel without a mouse and just
Yeah, that's the way
hotkeys.
you're supposed to do it. That's the way
Yeah,
you're supposed to do it, right? It's so much faster.
yeah. I was like, what do you mean? I use the mouse all the time.
Yeah,
Like I was like, I'm doing it wrong.
yeah.
So
You
that's
have to know
that's
all the shortcuts and all the codes and all that stuff. So it's definitely it's its own language. And when people are good at it, they're amazing.
Yeah, totally. And if you're looking back on your investment banking, kind of stint in that, what would you say kind of like was your like key takeaway from that experience? Obviously, outside of like now you're a spreadsheet assassin.
So I wouldn't discount sort of that one skill set in terms of being able to now be really effective, like running Excel. Maybe not just running Excel, but obviously doing financial modeling, doing analysis that you learn to do in investment banking. Because the next job I took was in the pharma industry again, but this time it was in corporate development. So this is like M&A, licensing, And it's all deal modeling, valuation, trying to make sure you come up with the right deal structure, but it's based on being able to do the right analysis. And coming out of that, coming with sort of a skill set now that I had, brought from that investment banking experience, was really incredibly useful at the time. And this was now where I had an advantage, right, over my colleagues, that they were not coming necessarily from that type of background. And then being able to do a lot of that really was, I think, you know, it was definitely a competitive advantage to be able to have some of those skills, and something that I still carry, many, many years later, that, I feel very comfortable trying to do the kind of analysis and modeling in Excel myself. Up to a certain level now, I've mostly forgotten a lot of the key things that I don't necessarily want to be doing those things anymore, but still have that capability to kind of go back and do a lot of that, which uh, again, it's from a career standpoint, it's differentiating, and that's, I think, one of the things that kind of a takeaway here is that what is it that you have as a skill that differentiates you above and beyond? It's not just I'm smarter, right? Because that's a hard thing to demonstrate. It
Yeah,
may not be
yeah,
true.
yeah,
In
yeah.
many cases, may not be true. So, how do you differentiate, and being able to have very clear areas where, hey, this is a specific skill that really is valuable and can apply well. I mean, that alone, I think, actually carries a lot of weight. So,
Totally. And I mean, there's all, just to kind of like continue on that wavelength a little bit, it's like there are a lot of smart people. Like there are a lot of smart people out there. So
there
like,
are.
yeah. And so, you're not alone. So it's kind of this thing I completely agree, is finding unique kind of angles or approaches or other kind of like dimensions in which you can differentiate is critically important. And with corp dev, like the model can break a transaction. Like if you don't do the analysis and you don't do the modeling right, that could be a bad acquisition, a good acquisition, and even outside of M&A, like we see it all the time at Exceeder. It's just like the power of just like being able to forecast and just like knowing kind of, obviously it's a little bit of fortune telling. You're like, you're looking into the crystal ball a little bit, but it feels like a little bit of a superpower to be able to look forward like that.
It is, and I think as modeling, if you're really into modeling, it's very advanced and it becomes more of a black box, right? Like nobody knows what the heck is actually happening once you put your numbers in, and then it spits out numbers on the other side. So I think kind of the next beyond that is, really having the ability to sort of communicate, and using that as a way to justify your arguments, and being able to sort of package that together in a way that you can kind of share with the management, say, hey, here's the analysis. I've kind of laid it out in a very clear and easy to understand way. Here's how the inputs work, and being able to really defend, like, this is why we want to do what we want to do. Um, that's kind of the way to, I think, apply it. Just beyond sort of the hardcore, like, because a model is just a model, right? And there's so many assumptions that go into it, and whether or not it's actually configured right or wrong, like nobody knows, right? And um, so it becomes more than on a communication side, like how can I leverage this in a way that now I can make it more clear for other people to understand?
Totally. And you're right. It is kind of a double-edged sword. Like
Yeah,
sometimes the model can feel like gospel. You're just
yeah,
like it, like that kind of like fortune telling element to it. People are like, nope, this is how the future will unfold.
yeah,
And you kind of have to put an asterisk to it, like a disclaimer. It's like subject to change, because all of these assumptions and inputs that we're putting in here, these are changing variables.
right.
And
Yeah,
but once you spit it out in a PDF, people are like, they hang it up. They're like, this is it. This is like what we're doing for the next
yeah.
6 months.
This is
Um,
this yeah, this is the truth.
yeah, this is the truth. And this corp dev role that you're in, was this at Bristol-Myers Squibb?
This was at Bristol-Myers Squibb, yeah, yeah. And I started in corp dev, and then also moved into marketing later. I wanted to do a little bit more kind of operational, really on the business side, and get into sort of true marketing. So that was the opportunity to kind of get onto the marketing side. And then I came back to corp dev again, but I also wanted to get international experience. So that was another thing on my checklist, right? I wanted international experience. So I came back to the corp dev group, but focused specifically on Asia Pacific as my geography. Yeah.
Very cool. Very cool. We talked about business being this very wide umbrella. Like, sales is obviously one component. You now know the finance, the corp dev, the M&A kind of transactional work. And then now there's like these two buckets, which are another kind of pillar within business of like marketing and then international kind of expansion and kind of, BD that way. On the marketing side, what were some like key lessons you learned when you did your stint in the marketing department?
Yeah, at the time we were launching kind of a new indication for breast cancer for one of the drugs that we had at Bristol-Myers Squibb. I mean, I think it's probably nothing necessarily earth-shattering as far as people who have done marketing would kind of find as like sort of new or novel, or not even like how you might think about marketing. But just in terms of how to kind of think about the different marketing channels that you need to go after. Like it's not just you're not just kind of creating sort of one channel or one focus. You really have to kind of figure out the best way to create the right mix of the different channels and be able to message through them and what content you want to drive into those different channels. And then again, it becomes sort of like this model, right? Where like, how does all of that sort of, help you get a return on that investment that you're making on all of these different channels? So, we had done a lot of work in that area to really figure out how to maximize, that activity and that investment. A lot of work on trade shows, right? Again, like not, and I think in today's world, it's a little bit old school, but, the trade show was such a core part of how do you interact with customers and how do you get, your message across. Like people would see you at the trade shows or see your company at the trade shows. And, what is it that actually what makes it a good trade show to be able to present at? Whether it's through your booth or whether it's through seminars or whether it's through KOL dinners, right? Just try to coordinate all of those activities. So a lot of, I mean, this was quite tactical, right? It was a lot of sort of tactics around what are the best ways to kind of really drive, customer adoption and customer awareness around the product.
Totally. And I have found the practice of marketing is also very analytical and very unlike, there's a lot of like financial models that go into marketing because like there's like this time and resource, like there's time and money going into a marketing initiative. But the running joke is like, I know half of my marketing spend works, but I don't know which half. Like
it's always a challenge, and you really have a hard time measuring it. And this is things that we talk today internally about how do we measure this and how do we evaluate success around different programs, because obviously there's a cost here and you've got limited resources, so you want to get the bang for your buck. Yeah, and I think and maybe the other thing I didn't layer on is that the scientific aspect of, I didn't talk about that, right? We're still on the science side.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. We're still doing science.
There's a big scientific aspect of this as well. Yeah. That's so key, right? I mean, we're selling to doctors and, in life sciences, or we're selling to research scientists and laboratories. So the science piece and being able to really communicate, like, what is the breakthrough here, or how do we talk about what's been developed from a medical application standpoint, really deeping dive into a lot of these studies and being able to present back the research from the studies. I mean, that was such a core part of what we did in marketing. Totally.
And I think it's kind of like, again, kind of like to go back to like the kitchen analogy or like an orchestra. There's like there's grounded in the science. Like obviously you have to have really good science, but you also need to be able to communicate it well. Like, because if you have really groundbreaking science but are unable to communicate it can sometimes just like fall flat and no one knows.
Yeah.
And obviously that lends itself well to actual sales too, when you're trying to actually like boots on the ground, try to interface with people. So you've now done kind of, you've gone, sounds like you leveled up a lot in terms of like marketing know-how, and you're now making this transition to international business development. Can you talk a little bit about that experience and how that unfolded?
Yeah. I mean, I think for international, I mean, I think at least for me, still young in the career, like just wanted to travel and wanted to
Yeah.
be out in different places and,
Yeah.
eat different
Yeah.
foods and stay at different hotels. I mean, that stuff was all exciting back then. I mean, it's
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
really like not necessarily too exciting today, but in those days, that was, I would say, part of the appeal, right?
Yeah.
Just wanted to have, some experiences to be able to go out and travel and do some of that. And it was a great way to sort of combine, some of the business experiences and then apply it also into different areas. And I think what's really interesting is that, a lot of my career is focused on kind of emerging fields, right? Emerging technology, emerging markets. But when I say emerging markets, you probably think about like, South America or, markets that are, not yet as, as rich maybe as the United States. But it's really a lot of this kind of early stage penetration of a business, of a product, and how to get into those markets. And that certainly was, I think, the experience for APAC. And then later also when I moved to my next role as well, which was focused on international, was really that was an opportunity really to learn about like, oh, this product's, it's been in the US for like 20 years, but it's the first time it's come to this
Yeah.
country.
Mm-hmm.
And so you really get the opportunity to figure out like, how are you building this business for this product line or this product area into a new marketplace.
Totally.
Yeah.
And that I think that's interesting too, because like we're currently going through a similar kind of like international expansion, and we've been doing the Exceeder thing in the United States for a long time, but
Yeah.
then we're like jumping in, we're just like, whoa, like it almost feels like brand new, like kind of emerging like company creation. It's like, oh, like this thing that I'm so familiar with, but in this context feels like brand new, brand new. Um, and so you're now doing international business development, and I know I've spoken to a lot of folks who want to like learn, like from a scientific background, want to break in to
Mhm.
business development. Would you have any advice for anyone who's looking to break into business development? Like, what are some like skill sets that are worth developing, and kind of what would it take to break that ice?
Yeah. And just to clarify, because business development sometimes has two different meanings in the industry. So sometimes business development, we think about it as more like sales, where you're effectively trying to usually a new market or a new product that you're kind of early on trying to drive sort of early adoption around. The business development I was in was still part of the corporate development side. So that's still more like M&A licensing. It's like the company level deal making rather than at a customer, end customer level transaction. So, but kind of to answer your question, maybe on both sides, I mean, I think, obviously having sales experience, again, it just applies everywhere, right? Because it is something that one is not always a good just skill set to have, but really just knowing the customer, right? That's what at the end of this people want to make sure, or you want to make sure that you have this capability where you understand the customer. So sales is the core way to really get that type of experience and understand the customer. And then, marketing on the other side of it really helps you to kind of understand like what are the groups of customers that we're
Yep.
dealing with, right?
Yep.
Then how do we kind of make sure we're messaging to these groups the right way? And then for me, because I said this more corporate development in this job role, it was really about that kind of bringing in some of that financial experience as well, like how to structure a deal, how to do the valuation, how to show the economics, for one side and the other side makes sense for both sides, and we can shake hands and get the deal done.
Absolutely. And I love hearing this too, because like I think sometimes science has a tendency to kind of like put the blinders on and just like hyper specialize. But what I'm hearing is that there's definitely benefit to be had to a breadth of knowledge and kind of being able to kind of like put on different hats at any given time. When, you know, obviously the kind of a general MO is to just like, boom, you are now this person and you do this one thing exceptionally well, but blinders are on.
Yeah, I mean, it's always a kind of interesting decision pathway, right? Whether or not you have a career which is really, you know, let's say you're into marketing and you kind of have, you know, you spend, you know, 30 years just doing marketing, and that you just keep kind of going up the marketing ladder, and that would be one path. Versus, you know, you're kind of doing some time here, you're doing a little bit of time there, you're picking up different skills in different areas. You know, there are pros and cons in both
Yes.
directions, I think,
Yes.
right? Because you don't necessarily want to be, you know, jack of all trades, master of none, right? And it's like, okay, like what skill do I actually bring? I'm not an expert in anything.
Yeah.
Right.
Totally.
So trying to kind of really think that through, I think it's an interesting decision point. I don't think there's really a right or wrong answer there. I certainly found in my own career that it was incredibly valuable to have broad experiences from different areas. And, you know, certainly in my current role, being able to have that, you know, background has allowed me to kind of understand, hopefully, you know, parts of the business better, think about strategy better, but also think about the underlying drivers that are, you know, important for our business.
And it's kind of what you're saying is kind of like it, instead of just being a jack of all trades, master of none, you kind of get that exposure, and then you figure out where your strengths are, and then you're like, okay, is finance is like finance. This is, but it's all additive and accretive, where like everything you kind of experienced kind of like makes you a better, in this case, finance person, or whatever it may be you choose.
Yeah, no, I think there's no doubt that any of your experiences hopefully should be accretive, right?
Yeah.
Add to, you know, hopefully your life journey. So I think you're always going to be able to benefit. So I think wherever there's sometimes an option of like, should I do this or shouldn't I do it? I think erring towards, you know, doing something, you know, generally tends to be a good decision, because you just get this new opportunity that you've had a chance to learn something different and something new. And hey, you know, maybe that's something that you didn't realize was going to be such an important part of your future life. So I do think that does play out. But I also think there's, in that sort of decision point of, you know, do you focus kind of in one area, and, you know, or do you kind of really try to diversify? I mean, I think a lot of it is also personality driven as well, right? Again, going back to, people have different personalities. People will do well in a certain types of pathways and do better maybe in other pathways. So I think you also have to kind of consider your own personality and figure out like, yeah, you know, I like to kind of go and sort of pick up new things and then try to integrate it all and then try to apply it, you know, to the next thing. Or, you know, I just love, you know, doing R&D and I just want to do that. That's all I want to, right?
Totally. And that's a great point. I you know, that is not to be understated. It's like, it has to work with your personality, because if it doesn't, you're going to wake up and get out of bed and be like, I don't like this. Like you'll want to just like, you know, throw in the towel. And like, it has to have at least some sort of like, it doesn't feel like friction, is what I would imagine, you know, it feeling.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think that comes down to, that's sort of the real question that you want to answer, right? It's for yourself. It's like, what is it that I really, you know, really want to do? And that's a hard question to answer sometimes, right? Because you think you want one thing, but then you don't really know until you've kind of gone through the process.
That's all for this episode of the Biotech Startups podcast. We hope you enjoyed our discussion with Terry Lowe. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave us a review, and share it with your friends. Thanks for listening, and we look forward to having you join us again for part 2 of our conversation with Terry. The Biotech Startups podcast is produced by Exceeder. Don't want to miss an episode? Search for the Biotech Startups podcast wherever you get your podcasts and click subscribe. Exceeda provides research labs with equipment leases on founder-friendly terms to support paths to exceptional outcomes. To learn more, visit our website www.exedr.com. On behalf of the team here at Exceeda, thanks for listening. The Biotech Startups podcast provides general insights into the life science sector through the experiences of its guests. The use of information on this podcast or materials linked from the podcast is at the user's own risk. The views expressed by the participants are their own and are not the views of Exceeda or sponsors. No reference to any product, service, or company in the podcast is an endorsement by Exceeda or its guests.